Anyway, so the last talk is entitled Raising Adults. Another title for it could be Adulting so somebody else doesn't have to. And I'm going to be a little less tied to my notes and kind of roll with it a little bit more. And it's very much intended to be a practical talk. So the question we should begin with, Mom and Dad, is what's the objective? What are we trying to accomplish when it comes to raising kids? Now, we should probably begin by admitting there should be several objectives and that they can be prioritized. Instead of making a long list, I'm just going to identify three different categories or three different lumps that we can put these objectives into. I think there are first-order objectives, secondary-order objectives, and then tertiary. So considering the audience, I'm pretty confident we're all on the same page when it comes to the first-order objectives, right? So that means passing on the faith. That's the first-order objective when we are raising children. We want to raise our children in the new covenant. And that includes a number of things: knowledge of God, obviously, attendance in a church, the ordinary means of grace, meaning preaching and the sacraments, observing the law, pursuing holiness, developing habits of personal devotion, like Bible reading and prayer, and submitting to the Lordship of Christ in all things. Those are all first-order objectives. If you get everything else right and those things don't happen, you have made a big mess of things. Now, this largely sums up the teaching that I've heard in Christian circles on parenting. The focus has been on first-order objectives. So a lot of good instruction has been, presented to me over the years on the subject of, how to teach your children to pray, how to conduct family worship, on all of that, even some rudimentary pedagogy, and I think that's all great. But let me just raise a question and see how you respond to it. You don't need to say your response out loud, but this is a rhetorical question. What if your kid loves the Lord but remains single and without a livelihood at 32 years of age and lives in your basement? Have you done your job? Now, one way to think about this is, let's just call this child Johnny. Is Johnny in any position to pass on the covenant himself at that point? No. There's no one to pass it on to. There's no one to live with and to share those covenantal responsibilities with. So what we want to see develop is, children who form households of their own someday. By the way, in many parts of the world, this was considered a father's job, helping the next generation form a household. When I talk to guys about children, I say, when the kids are small and cute, mom is the center of their world. When they're big and ugly, that's the time that you are really important. So, when it comes to, helping your children form households, in many parts of the world, like I noted, it was a father's job at that point to step in. Now, it doesn't mean mom is not involved. Obviously, she's involved in a big way. But this is where a father says, okay, this is my task. I need to help make this happen. So I had a fun experience. I did a family life conference in India, and they still have dowries there. And that was a big subject in the course of the conference, is what about the dowries? So, we were joking earlier, I think it was Seth joked about the bride price, all that kind of stuff. So you got a cow and some other things. We're having fun here. But in some cultures, that's the way it works. But in other cultures, it's the dowry, which means that it's the woman's family's responsibility to provide seed capital for the establishment of a new household. That's the idea behind the dowry. So the idea is that, you want them to get off to a good start. And so there are certain things that, are necessary, like a house and like maybe even a business, a new business getting established. And in Indian culture, that's one of the reasons why you just see Indians in certain industries just again and again and again, because it's the way it's done. So if you've ever wondered why every 7-Eleven is like owned by a guy named Patel, it's because this is the way it works. So, and of course in the caste systems, various castes are known for different things. They're the military caste, they're the ruling caste, they're just different things that each caste is known for. And Patel is kind of the hospitality or the grocery caste. And that's kind of what they know, and that's how they fund that kind of stuff, families, kind of mentoring younger families and helping them get established. Anyway, I note that because we don't do much of that in our world, in the West. We kind of like just say, hey, have at it, good luck. We don't do much to help form new households, and I think that's something that we need to do a better job with. As I've already noted, there's kind of a crisis in this respect in our society. Now, so there are a whole array of things that we want our kids to do that don't seem to fit into the first order objectives, right? First order objectives are law and gospel things, things that God requires, and then, of course, gospel to reconcile us to God because we fail to do the things that we're supposed to do. And there's a good reason other things don't rise to that level. I don't mean to imply that the things I'm going to talk about in this talk are first order. They're second order objectives. They're not as important, but they're still important. Just because they're not first order objectives doesn't mean they're, worthless. So what are those other things? How about your vocation? Now, we should say that there's a sense in which vocation should be a first order objective, but in another sense, it's not. Like, what are you going to do? What are you called to? That kind of thing is secondary in character. How about habits conducive to success? I think those are important. One of the cardinal virtues, I think, is prudential judgment. We want our children to be able to exercise good judgment in life. So that's another thing that we want them to be able to exercise in order to be, able to establish a household of their own and live a life that's productive. How about physical exercise? I think that's important. Financial management. How to invest your savings. Whom to marry? That's pretty significant. What to look for. How to go about finding a spouse. Now, we might not be willing to bind the conscience when it comes to these matters, but that doesn't mean they're indifferent matters. They are important matters, and consequently, we ought to attend to them. I think one of the reasons why a lot of young men, particularly today, are listening to people like Joe Rogan and Jocko Willink and others is because they're not getting this kind of advice from the men in their lives. They're not getting this, things that relate to these matters from their pastor or from the elders or maybe even their father. It's just sort of like there's no one filling the space in their immediate circle on these matters, and so they turn to these guys to get some guidance. So what I'd like to do is think about this with you a little bit. I think one of the ways we can grasp the horns of this apparent dilemma is by recalling that law and gospel don't exhaust the Scriptures. Like we think about what are the Scriptures constituted of? Well, obviously law and gospel, but there's another category, wisdom. Pretty big one. So I think these matters fall into the category of wisdom. Now, when it comes to these matters, can we wisely discuss them? I think we can. And I propose a further classification when it comes to secondary matters, or a description or a label. I would say this is adult stuff. This is adult stuff. Now, there is this term adulting. Are you guys familiar with this term adulting? Why do we turn nouns into verbs like that? There's actually a term called verbing. So if somebody has taken the word adult and turned it into a verb. And apparently it's a thing. I was kind of surprised that it was a thing, but I learned about it, and I was impressed with the idea that it's premised on the truth that adults should be capable of doing certain things. And the adulting phenomenon is essentially a cry for help by people who have grown to a certain point but don't know how to do adult stuff. And so they pretend, or they kind of fake it till they make it, you could say. Now, I read a New York Post article recently. It's not all that recent, though, in terms of when it was published. It was published back in 2017, but it was in the New York Post, and it was entitled, "Adulting Classes Prove Millennials' Nitwit Parents Are to Blame." Okay, so we might treat them like nitwits, but who raised these nitwits? Nitwit parents. So the opening sentence of the article gives you a sense of what we're dealing with here. It says, for years now, evidence has been accumulating that millennials contain within themselves a weird combination of grandiosity and an inability to leave the house. They're self-absorbed, but global thinking, smug and terrified. Anyway, so the article goes on to describe an adulting school that was founded by a psychotherapist named Rachel Weinstein and an elementary school teacher named Katie Brunell. And it's pitched to prospective students with these words. I'm going to edit it a little bit because there's an expletive in the sentence. We know you're sick of feeling like you're pretending to be a grown-up, and that someone is going to realize that you don't know anything about what you're supposed to know. So a lot of kids feel like no one helped me navigate these waters, and here I am in the boat. Now, the answers to the school begins with an adulting quiz. And it's really more of a yes or no set of responses that you give rather than an actual quiz. Maybe they didn't want people to think they could get the answer wrong. So, anyway. So here are a few questions into the adulting quiz. I know how much money I have and how to get to it. Can you imagine answering no to that? Well, apparently, some people need help in that area. I'm comfortable following recipes. I remember I came across this gal who talked about MacGyvering food. I don't know, remember that television show MacGyver, where he would concoct various things to help him get what he needed, like get out of jail or get his handcuffs out, or whatever. And she thought making dinner for yourself was like MacGyvering. She was used to everything being pre-prepared. Just pop it in the microwave or get it, at the fast food joint. So she said, I'm not going to MacGyver the dinner. I know when, to use which form of correspondence. Now, why isn't why aren't they responding to my texts? I applied for this job, 3 weeks ago, and I've been texting ever since. Well, maybe because texting is a dumb idea when it comes to applying for a job. And would you know that? Well, apparently some people don't. Classes began at $19.99. So apparently they're not smart enough to know that $20, is essentially paying $20. But anyway, now I wish I could say that this doesn't apply to Christian young adults, but it does. It even applies to homeschooling and classical schooling families, and I've observed this. In fact, I have friends who are successful entrepreneurs, really successful, multi-million-dollar companies, who won't hire a lot of young men who come from homeschooling and classically schooled homes. And it's because they're soft. They're not able to rise to the standards that are required in order for them to be gainfully employed. And so consequently, they just don't hire these guys. So there's a lot of screening and a lot of disappointment. There's a lot of commiserate. By the way, these guys who are very successful are actually homeschooled guys who are now adults and now own really large companies. And they're homeschooling their kids. So it's not like they're against homeschooling or against classical education, but they're wondering, why are these kids so soft? Why can't, they take the direction that, I'm giving them, and why do I have to always be nice to them all the time, or they just get into a funk? Why can't they take good, straight, direct criticism without collapsing? This kind of stuff. Well, so welcome to my school of raising adults so that they won't have to take adulting classes. That's the nature of this talk. Now, this is more art than science. I think this is one of the problems that we have. We're always looking for the right technique, the foolproof method. Follow this, A, B, C, and ultimately you get D every single time. That's your approach to raising kids. I'm glad I'm not your kid. Anyway, but what I'm describing is more of an art than a science. So if you're looking for laws which lead to inevitable outcomes and techniques that are indifferent to context or the character of your child, I'm not your guy. An artist works with the materials on hand. In this case, your children and your household, which means that two things should be true. You should have an ideal in mind, but you should study your children. Study them. Understand how they think, what makes them tick, what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are. One of the fun things, like when my wife and I were welcoming our children into the world, my wife very much had this, I am the molder of my children mindset, And I was more like, I'm the discoverer of our children mindset. Like, what is this kid about? And so, it was kind of fun to learn, wow, this kid's like this. It's not like they're entirely silly putty that you can shape into any form you please. They come kind of pre-made. And you're kind of like, wow, who's this little stranger in my house? Why do they behave the way they do? Well, God wired that kid that way. And so rather than see this as a problem, we ought to think of it as an opportunity. So I've got 6 grandchildren now, and I was with 2 of them, and one of them is Anna, and it was a lot of fun watching her. She's a lot of fun to kind of be with, and very bright, but she had these hiking boots, and they were like, tiny little hiking boots. They were really super cute, right? And she was determined that she was going to put her own shoes on. She's like less than 2, maybe like, 20 months or a month at the most or something like that. And she wanted to tie her own shoes too. She was not going to let anyone help her in any way. And if you tried to help her, it was like the end of the world. Now what you could do with that, there are lots of things you could do with that. This is not the best response. Now, if she's still doing that when she's 25, that's a big problem. But now, she's a little person trying to understand what she's about. And what you see, at least what I said when I saw this, I said, this is really good. This is excellent. What we got to figure out is how to direct this in a positive way. Because stubbornness directed in the right way is a really good thing. Right? You want to figure out, how do I help this girl direct that stubbornness? Now, there are some places where the stubbornness is stupid. But there are other ways. In fact, she fell. Her shoelaces were untied. She stepped on her shoelace and she went down. And of course, that was a problem. But she was still determined to tie her own shoes, even though, it would be complicated for like most adults to tie those shoes. But anyway, so studying your kids, having an ideal, but studying your kids, understanding how to work with your children, their strengths, their weaknesses, their gifts, their interests, all these different things. And an example of an ideal that you want to develop in a child is personal responsibility, right? Being responsible. So in this particular case, that was already there, personal responsibility. I want to tie my own shoes. Like, that's really great. It's not good that you're walking around with your untied shoes because you can't figure out how to do it on your own. But the fact that you want to do it is something that we want to see continue to be the case, that you have a desire to take responsibility for yourself and do things for yourself. So obviously this means there can't be a simple list of do's and don'ts, no surefire techniques. There will be exceptions and qualifications, and that will need to be made with regard to everything I'm about to say. So I have 3 grown children, all very different. I think I described them to you already, but just let me quickly review. My oldest is an audio engineer, owns his own business in Nashville, and works in the music and publishing industries. He's the guy that actually produces the podcast. He's the guy that did our documentary at Oxford. So if you've seen the documentary, he was the guy that was behind the scenes and did all of that. And my daughter-in-law who's Whitney. She was really good at like organizing everything. So they were both working on this behind the scenes the whole time. So that's my oldest son. He was the athlete. Like when he was just a little guy, he just had tremendous eye and hand coordination. He ended up playing on the town baseball team. He played high school basketball. You could just kind of see it from the start. I remember when he was I'm going to tell the story about T-ball in a minute, so I won't get ahead of myself. So anyway, my second son had no interest in sports at all. But he was really good with his hands, but in a micro-like coordinated way, as opposed to macro. So macro coordination is when you see an athlete who's able to, do things as he runs and dribbles or whatever, so his macro coordination. Micro coordination is more hand skill kind of oriented. And I could see very early on that he was really gifted with that kind of thing. And so I said, okay, we're not going to push sports on this kid. We're going to pursue a different approach. He was interested in working with his hands, so we got him involved in all kinds of things that would, draw on his skills. I remember one time we took a small engine repair course together. And he was always correcting me the whole time. He just had this ability, kind of conceptually, to just think in 3 dimensions, and understand the inner workings of mechanisms and engines and stuff like that. It just comes really naturally to him. And then my daughter, who I've talked to you about with the baking, but she's just really, really super bright. She scored in the top 1% in the SAT on both the math and the language. So she's kind of Ivy League material. And she didn't want to go to college. I had to talk her into going to college. And I'll tell you that story in a minute. But so she was kind of a very kind of oriented toward literature, but also had a really strong set of convictions about kind of the way things should be done. And so kind of working. I remember this one experience we had with her. We had some workmen come to the house when we were on Cape Cod, and she was just a little girl, maybe 3. And she looked out the window, and there were some of the guys who were there to work on the house were smoking. And so she looked out the window and said, "Ooh, bad men. They're smoking." And they could hear her. And that was kind of her way. She would embarrass her mom a lot. So now they're all grown. They have children of their own, homes of their own, and I don't take any credit for their achievements. And that's where the art comes in. They have taken responsibility for their own lives, and their achievements are their own by God's grace. So I'm very pleased with how things have turned out, but I don't take credit for those things. And I think that's the thing that we ought to be thinking about. We don't want to get to the point where we can take credit for our kids' achievements. We want our children to achieve and be pleased that they're achieving, but they're not necessarily ego trips for us, right? If you think of your kid as a sort of a way to boost your ego, you're on a really shaky foundation already. You shouldn't think in those terms at all. Now, when it comes to raising an adult, what should you keep? What should you look for? Well, I already noted we should have the end in mind. We want children who are capable of doing certain things. And in my case, I really had a strong conviction that I wanted my children to be able to exercise good judgment in life. Not necessarily have me looking over their shoulder all the time telling them what to do, but I wanted them to have the power to exercise judgment for themselves. So I thought that was something that I should really work toward. So I was looking for the first of the cardinal virtues, prudence. The other virtues, of course, are courage and temperance and justice, and they're all important. But being prudent doesn't mean you're afraid to take action. It just means your action is well thought out and appropriate. Sometimes you take risks. Sometimes the most prudent thing to do is to take a risk. So you don't want to be like the deer in the headlights. A lot of kids are kind of the deer in the headlights. They're not really prudent, they're just fearful. Prudence is the proper, sort of the median. This is the way Aristotle would talk. When Aristotle would talk about any virtue, he'd say that there are 2 ways to get things wrong for every 1 way to get things right. You can have too much or too little of something. So when it comes to fear, when we think about fear, you can have too much or too little. Both are a problem. Prudence is the right amount. So now, and also when you think about fear, you can be afraid of the right thing and you can be afraid of the wrong thing. Like if you were so fearful that you never take a risk, you're fearful in a very debilitating way. Because you should be afraid to lose an opportunity, right? That's an appropriate way to be afraid. So, if you're the sort of guy that, would love to maybe approach a young woman and see if she would be interested in getting to know you, well, there's a risk there, right? But if you're so afraid of being rejected and you don't take any action at all, you've already failed, right? So you've got to have enough risk tolerance to be willing to experience rejection. And if that's not the case, then you need to build your risk tolerance because life is full of those sorts of opportunities. And if you're not ready to rise to the occasion, you're going to miss out on all kinds of stuff, and you're just going to fail by not trying. So now when it comes to forming a household or moving out and pursuing a life, I think a lot of us, and I've seen this over the years, we're kind of ditzy about this. We kind of just think it's going to just happen, and there's no intentionality behind it that required. That kid reaches a certain magical point, and then poof, they do stuff, and they're an adult. What we want is for adults to work with their children to help bring that about. Now, when I look at parents, I see that problem, but I also see another problem, and that is some parents just look like they never are going to let go. I don't know if you've gotten a sense of that when you've observed it. Maybe you even think about that with regard to yourself. So whether it's a domineering style that leaves no room for a child to practice independent judgment, or a helicopter approach that never lets Johnny out of sight and intervenes at the very first sign of trouble, in either case, because a child is not free to fail, they inevitably fail. There is no such thing as learning how to exercise good judgment without the prospect of making a bad judgment or a bad choice. It's just the way it is. So you're going to have to find a way to reconcile yourself to that. I think what I'd like to do now is go through a few categories or things that I tried to keep in mind as I worked with our kids. And again, I'm not saying that this is necessarily the only way to do things. Again, this is more art than science. But the first thing I tried to do was hone the edge. Hone the edge. Everyone has an edge. You've got an edge. It's where you end and other people begin, or it's also where other people end and you begin. So there's a point at which you stop and other people begin, and there's a point where other people stop and you begin. Now, the second tablet of the law in the Ten Commandments addresses the edges. The Ten Commandments reinforce boundaries. Do not steal. Do not murder. Do not lie, right? All of these things. Do not commit adultery. In other words, what you're doing, what the commandments are establishing is a set of boundaries. This is where you end and they begin. That's their stuff, not your stuff. That's that person's life, not your life. That's that person's wife, not your wife. So there's a sense that, okay, that's the edge. You need to hone the edge. Now, this implies something that I think we tend to forget. As we're raising kids, we're so focused on making sure that Johnny the tyrant doesn't take other people's stuff that we forget that Johnny needs to defend his own stuff, right? So there needs to be an edge that's honed in this respect as well. If we don't see that happen, Johnny can become soft, permeable, and dependent. Johnny needs to be able to say no sometimes. So no isn't always bad. No has its place. So Johnny needs to learn how to stand up by himself and stand up for himself. And the same thing's true with girls. So here's a controversial thought. If we want children to take care of themselves as well as exercise prudent judgment or agency in the world, we need to help them hone their edges. And honing the edge means sharpening the edge so that violating the edge will hurt. You don't talk to me that way. That kind of stuff. So you need to be able to have an edge. Now, someone raised the Sermon on the Mount to me with regard to this matter once, noting that Jesus told us not to resist an evil person. But I'm pretty sure that Jesus didn't have a rapist in mind. When it comes to a rapist, I want my daughter not only to resist an evil person, I want her to do as much damage as she possibly can. I want her to resist. I want her to scratch. I want her to scream. I want her to say, no, you are not allowed to do that. Now, she might be overpowered, but I want her to put up a fight, right? I don't think that's sinful, right? So, how do we raise our kids to be able to appropriately assert this is how far you may go? This is the boundary. Now, the flip side of that, of course, is I'm responsible for what's on the inside of this. This is my space, and I'm responsible for it. So I'm not interested in promoting a quarrelsome spirit or edginess or anything like that. I am interested in helping kids resist bullies and stand up to them in the playground, though. Right? That's a good thing. Now, I know that in our world today, there is a tendency to encourage kids to not stand up for themselves and instead just kind of snitch on each other. By the way, in the culture of my childhood, snitch was just like one step down from well, you get my drift. Intact blue-collar families tend to be better at this than white-collar families, I've noticed. I don't know if anybody else has made this observation. Ironically, in upper-middle-class families, they actually discourage this, particularly with the boys. They encourage their girls to lean in, right, and all that kind of stuff, and to be assertive, and that's fine. But the boys are always supposed to be nice, always deferential. They're always supposed to go to the people in charge and tell them what's going on rather than take matters into their own hands. But in the real world, sometimes no one's there to do that. In the real world, you've got to be able to stand up for yourself sometimes. So how do we help them to do that? Well, learning to do that is an art, and that art is best learned by imitation. So have your children ever seen you stand up to somebody? That was a school. That was a learning experience for them when they saw you do that. Maybe at a business or maybe on the street. Maybe there was some occasion where someone was behaving in a way that was inappropriate and you stood up to that person. Well, that was a moment. That was a teachable moment. The child may not say anything, but they learned an important lesson at that time when they saw you do that. You've planted a seed that someday will bear some fruit, hopefully. So where is all this leading? Well, I think what I'm getting to is that personal responsibility means taking care of yourself and not being taken advantage of. And you're responsible for both those things. So you need to be thinking about those things with your children. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that you enroll them in martial arts school, although I'm fine with that, But it does mean that you need to hone the edges at home, and you need to help them understand what their responsibilities are. And furthermore, and this is the weird thing, you need to be careful not to violate the edges yourself too much. Because if you do, if you become not just a helicopter parent, but like the lawnmower parent. Have you ever heard of the lawnmower parent? The lawnmower parent is the parent who goes before the child, removing all the obstacles all the time. So there's never any difficulty in the child's life. Just smooth everywhere. The helicopter parent is the one that comes in at the last second and saves the day. You're not going to give Johnny an F even though he's never been in class and doesn't understand a single thing you taught. That's not what I'm paying for. I'm paying for A's. I've actually heard people talk that way. So, honing the edge. Now, related to this is the freedom to fail. Johnny or Susie, whatever name you want to insert, needs to be free to fail. Gets me back to my point about lawnmower and helicopter parenting. Now, I was first introduced to safe spaces on Cape Cod when I was a T-ball coach. So this is, T-ball, no one loses in T-ball. It's all about participation, right? Having fun, being outside, running around, all that kind of stuff. Well, I had this fun experience when I was there, because when we arrived on the Cape, by the way, is a very Tony place, very upper, sort of, but it's an interesting place in the sense that the old Capers they're blue-collar people, and they're the people who work for, do the lawn care for, fix the pipes for all of the super wealthy. So think about Cape Cod, you got millionaires, on the Cape, you got like decamillionaires on Martha's Vineyard, and the billionaires live out on Nantucket. So that's kind of the world that we entered when we went there, and I served a church on the Cape as a pastor, and we were new to the community, so we didn't know, and I mentioned earlier that my oldest son was really into baseball and that kind of stuff, and so he was only 5 years old, so obviously T-ball. So we signed up late. Turned out that all the other kids had already been assigned teams. You know how these super upper middle class people are. They're always planning. They're always on top of things. So they had all figured out. So all the leftovers, the people who signed up late, my son was thrown into that bunch, and all the other boys were blue collar kids, which was great. So all these blue-collar kids were bigger, stronger, faster, and more athletic than all these wimpy kids from upper middle-class backgrounds. And so because there was like nobody to coach them, they needed a coach, so I said, I'll do it. So me and another guy who worked at the lumber yard, who was a blue-collar guy, would show up half drunk most of the time. He was fun. We would hang out and do stuff together. But so we coached this team. It was like right out of the Bad News Bears, right? So all these little boys and all the other teams, it was inclusive, so there were, but the blue-collar families just sent the boys to play ball. So we had this like team of like 5-year-old ringers. And the only uniform that was left was the Yankees. And this was Massachusetts. So we'd have 5-year-old boys running onto the field and they'd be booed. Boo! Because people hated Yankees so much, it doesn't matter that you're 5 years old. Man, you see the Yankee hat, that's it. It's over. So anyway, during the course of this season, the boys would ask, "Who's winning?" And we'd have to give them the official line, "We don't keep score." And they say, no, we know we're winning 30-0. And they were. And they're like, "Yeah!" And they'd run around like a bunch of chickens without heads and stuff like that. Anyways, those boys became the town traveling team. Almost the entire team became the town traveling team eventually. And my son would go to the vineyard and go to Nantucket to play the super rich kids and beat them. So it was a lot of fun during those years. So no one can fail. Everybody gets a trophy, that kind of thing. Now, eventually, at a certain point, the moms recede into the background and the dads take over. And that's when it gets serious and competitive. But there is a kind of overlap that takes a while to work through. I remember another thing, so I was also the soccer coach. So I played collegiate soccer, so I became the soccer coach for this group, and it was all the same boys. And we just destroyed everybody. It was great. We would just we would win like 10-0, that kind of thing. But it was always kind of awkward. And this was years later, so it wasn't T-ball anymore. So this by this time the boys were, I think it was 7, 8, 9 years old, something like that. I remember this was one game, and they were just racking up the goals. I think it was 7-0, and I was like, I'm trying to figure out ways to keep them from scoring. So what I did is I took all the guys that normally played fullback and I put them up front, and I figured, well, they're not as good. They just took off, and they just this is my chance. I don't get this opportunity very often. Next thing you know, it's 10-0, and I had all these moms on the other side shouting at me, cussing at me about how heartless I was. I'm trying. What do you want me to do? Break their legs? Anyway. But we were kind of on the edge at that point. But after that, it was just like go for it, and it was Dad's world. Anyway, when it comes to this, today we see safe spaces everywhere, colleges even, businesses, protected and favored groups and stuff, where they're never supposed to ever be disturbed. Everybody has to affirm them all the time, in every possible way. And if you express any disapproval, man, you are like evil. So when I think about all of this, I come from a very different world. So I long before latchkey kids and free-range parenting, I was on my own back in the day. So my parents were, in the 1960s, kind of the me generation. And believe me, that meant that I was all on my own most of the time. So I learned to take care of myself. I got into lots of fights as a kid, got killed a couple of times, or nearly killed a couple of times, committed crimes with my friends. So, but, and I'm not encouraging any of that kind of stuff, but what I learned through those days of kind of being on my own, I was pretty much on my own from the time I was about 8 years old. A few things I think that are really kind of worth noting, and I think if we can find ways to encourage these things in our children, they'll be well served. One is situational awareness. I learned to know where I was and with whom. And that's proved helpful because it's helped me keep my head in some tight spots over the years. I've been in, some pretty kind of edgy, sort of odd situations. I was in the Shavu gang fight in Boston that actually made the front page of the Boston Globe. I was actually on the ground in the middle of the whole thing. And that's just one example. I didn't die, although there were kids stabbed. I think about a number of number of kids who were arrested. It was a wild night. Bring me back sometime and I'll tell you about it. Another thing is I learned to think on my feet. Learn how to think fast, talk fast. This is a helpful skill. It applies to everything. Even when your wife says, "Did you remember?" "Oh, I didn't, but I can't admit that." If you get my drift. And then risk tolerance. Risk tolerance, your ability to live in situations where there is no guarantee that you will be safe. You need to develop an intuition of what your odds are in situations like that, and know when to run and where to run at certain points. I'm speaking metaphorically, not just physically, but because of a well-developed capacity for risk, I've been able to do a number of things in my life that were risky, like go to that gang fight. So that was actually the result of some intentional things that I was involved with. I didn't stage the fight, it happened, but I was in a situation where I knew something like that could happen. So with those things in mind, you might be wondering, what are parents good for? Well, actually a great deal. I missed out on many things as a kid that I really wish I'd had good parental guidance to help me navigate. For example, my academic performance was really poor at one point in my life. I hated 8th grade so much I took it twice. I just never went to school. I just played hooky all the time. And, that was not a good thing. And there are other things that kids who grew up in intact families enjoyed that I didn't have an opportunity to enjoy. So safe spaces aren't bad. It's just that we need to develop personal responsibility, and safe spaces are not the place where that happens. So we need to find open places as well as safe spaces. And we need to keep those things separate. Open places by nature are unstructured and unsupervised. And they often are literally outside, right? Did you ever see that film, A River Runs Through It? That's a marvelous film. Robert Redford was the director. It's about a Presbyterian pastor and his 2 sons. And it's about the thing that they had in common, which was fly fishing, but also explores sort of the things that distinguish them from each other. One of the sons was rebellious in character. It's based on, it's a true story, by the way. And what those boys were is they were homeschooled by their father. And because he was such an exacting teacher, there's just this marvelous scene where he's working with the boys and correcting their work. So they were in a very structured, heady environment in the mornings, and then in the afternoons, they were free. And they show this scene where they're in their house with their father for the morning, and then in the afternoon, they're literally running through the hills of Montana. It's a beautiful kind of scene. But that balance between structure, safety, openness, risk, it's really important to have both of those things in the life of a child. When you are in these unsupervised spaces, particularly when you're outside, you're media-free, task-free. Sometimes boredom is a really great thing for kids because when they're bored, they learn how to entertain themselves. Be a good idea to keep the phones away from them, at certain points and so forth. I'm sure I don't have to talk to you folks about that. But because parents are necessarily loving and caring and anxious for their kids, you're going to have to deal with some anxiety when it comes to this, right? So how do you deal with that? The anxiety that you feel about, maybe your child could potentially in some way harm themselves. Now, one of the things when it comes to this matter is, generally speaking, this isn't always the case, but generally speaking, the father tends to be the advocate for unstructured time. The mother tends to be less sympathetic to that. And that's not, like I said, it's not always the case. But it was the case in our house. So I remember there came a point with our second son where I informed my wife that I was getting him a pocket knife. He was maybe 7. And she said, "But he can cut himself." And I said, "Of course, that's how he's going to learn it sharp." And he literally has scars all over his hands, from, cutting himself with this knife. Now, today, he doesn't cut himself with knives. I want you to just, he learned that it was sharp and learned how to handle knives and that kind of stuff. And he handles much more dangerous equipment now because he's, works with steel. I remember one time he almost burned the garage down. That was pretty interesting. And he was learning how to weld and doing different things. But anyway, so there are lots of things that can happen. But generally speaking, you need to be able to live with a measure of anxiety because kids can harm themselves. Now, what that means, of course, is you can't let just anything happen. There needs to be some prudence as a parent, in this whole process. But there's still going to be what ifs. What ifs? I know all the kids are like remembering everything I'm saying right now. I'm going to bring it up to you later. Anyway. So next thing I think it's important for us to talk about is standards and the internalization of standards. What you really want is your child to not just submit to standards, but to internalize them, make them their own. So standards are usually encountered by children as external sets of rules, right, that they're supposed to observe. They're not supposed to do certain things, they're supposed to do other things. But as long as the rules are outside us, we need other people to apply them to us, right? And often we resist and we resent. We don't like other people applying those standards to us. And so long as that's the case, we're not going to be in a position to exercise good judgment for ourselves. A child's not going to be in a position to exercise good judgment for herself or himself, as much as just kind of living under the judgment of other people. What we really should be striving for is the internalization of standards so that the child is able to apply the standards himself or herself to himself or herself. So how does this happen? I think, again, most parents apply standards to children and then just hope that they get it. And as a result, they turn to carrots and sticks to encourage the process along. And that's fine. I think both of those things, a carrot or a stick, is necessary. Most kids don't respond to carrots. They prefer candy bars and stuff like that. But you get my point. So I think that we don't resort to the stick as much as we used to. Maybe this church is a bit different, but in many cases, I think people rely heavily on the praise method. The idea of just kind of reinforcing positive behavior with good vibes. Just affirming all the time. Now, this is closely related to the self-esteem cult. The idea that if we just help kids feel good about themselves, that they'll achieve. That's just not true. When it comes to international performance on standardized math tests, American kids think they're just awesome, and they score really low. And South Korean kids think they're awful and are at the top. So what's the better approach? Telling your kid he's like wonderful and he's not, or getting a kid to think that, I can always do better and I'm not living up to my potential? I hope the second, right? That's what we should be striving for. So when it comes to this, generally what we say to our child, if the child brings us, say, a crayon drawing, we say, "Johnny, that is the most awesome crayon drawing ever," right? Now the problem with that, of course, is grade inflation. So what do you do when Johnny makes a better drawing? Does it go from awesome to super awesome? Does it go to you are like the greatest human being that ever lived? We were all just going to bow to you and worship you now. Look at that crayon drawing. I can actually recognize what you did. I think that's a person. What do you do with that? So we have to have a measured approach. I'm not against praising a child, and I'll get to that in a minute. But at the same time, we can have the opposite problem if we turn to the stick too quickly. Again, as I noted, this is not a big problem in our world, but essentially what you have in that situation when you turn to the stick too quickly is everything becomes a matter for some kind of corporal punishment. And what that does is that over time, because of the inflation that occurs, the value of the discipline is lost. So it's like an inflationary process. And often the child will build resistance, and there's not much effect any longer. And it can even lead to resentment. So you don't want to go there. So instead, you want children who do good work for the satisfaction of doing good work. You want your children to become their most unsympathetic critic. Not in a super negative sense, but just in the sense that I know what good work looks like. So how do we help that occur? Well, the etymology of the word educate, I think, is helpful here. It means to draw out. What we want is our child to reach out and grab the standard and pull it into himself or herself and own it. That's the goal. That's what we're striving for. So how do we accomplish that? Well, I think the Socratic method is helpful. The Socratic method proceeds with a series of questions and answers, right? So let's return to Johnny's crayon drawing. Instead of saying, awesome, when Johnny presents the crayon drawing, you can start with a question. What did you draw? And then let Johnny tell you. This encourages him to describe it and maybe even do it in great detail, maybe way more detail than you want. But anyways, what you're wanting to do is get him to tell you what he did, and what you should try to do is reserve your praise for the best parts. If there's something that maybe is a little better than something else, say, well, you really did that well. And sometimes you don't even have to say anything else, because the child will get, wow, he didn't say that was good. Why not? And then maybe you can get into that. Maybe if the child asks, well, what about this? Well, then you explain it. But oftentimes, just silence is all you need. I remember one time my father did something. My father wasn't a very good father. And even this illustration, I think, demonstrates that he was sort of lazy. But I remember one time I had done something that I should be punished for. I don't know, maybe it was like I cut my sister's doll's hair or something. I don't know what it was. Anyway, so it was something like that. And so my father said, all right, we got to deal with this. He said, what I'm going to do is this. I want you to go to your room, think about what you did, develop a punishment, come back and report to me, and if it's not good enough, I'll think of something. So what did that do? Forced me to go to my room and say, what did I do? Why was that wrong? Okay, what would be a just? So I'm actually exercising, judgment on myself, knowing that if it's not good judgment, someone else is going to overrule. Then I came back to my father and I told him what the punishment should be, and he said, that's pretty good. That's worse than I would have given you, but this is what we'll go with. I was like, okay. But the idea is I've internalized it. I've internalized the standard. I know, okay, that was wrong. Punishment was deserved. I've got to report what the punishment will be. Boom. Very helpful. As you can tell, it made a big impression on me. But that's what we're trying to get at, is children who know right and wrong, internalize standards, understand that the nature of the work that they perform should rise to standard, all that kind of stuff. Now, I think when this is really well done, the children kind of take off. They thrive with this kind of stuff. So, in our house, there were a number of things that we did that, as I look back on it now, I think were really helpful to bring about this end result. But all my kids have a really, I think, balanced approach to things, and they're both very handy. They know how to do things. They're very skilled in the things that they apply themselves to. I can show you a picture of something my daughter created knitting that's just unbelievable in terms of the detail and so forth. I'm just kind of astonished that she did it. At the same time, they're all kind of bookish. So they're practical and they're bookish at the same time. So my second son, when he goes to the shop, he'll take, some German or Russian literature along with him. He'll read like Dostoevsky on his break, that kind of thing. And when they get together in the room, I feel like the dunderhead. I was like, they're all talking about, the latest novel that they read. I don't know what you're talking about. They're kind of beyond me now. They're just kind of, because they have this passion for good art, good literature, things that challenge them intellectually, and they're interacting with each other all the time and talking about the stuff and they're all kind of doing it independently. It's not like I'm back behind the scenes, with a whip saying, you need to do this. They're kind of on their own, pursuing that kind of stuff. So it's doable. It's doable. It can happen. And that's really what you're looking for. You're looking for that. You're not looking for necessarily a kid that does everything the way you would do it, right? Or is living a life with, you kind of always looking over the shoulder, that kind of thing. You want to be able to walk in and be surprised. And, wow, look what you just did. That's amazing. Oh, that's nothing. Yeah, well, it's pretty significant to me. That kind of thing. That's where you want to find yourself. But I think that if we take this approach, when we think about some of these matters, and I'm sure you can add stuff. I mean, like I said, I'm not saying that this is exhaustive by any stretch, but these are things that I did that I thought would be helpful to share. And if you can raise children who grow to be adults, children that you can respect, that's the goal. You want to be able to raise children that you can respect, so that today I depend on them for all kinds of stuff. I ask their advice about stuff because they know about certain things that I don't know. And I'll ask their opinions, and I'll actually take their their advice at times. That's what you're looking for. That's a great blessing. And I think that's the goal of, any healthy mom or dad out there, is being able to raise kids like that you can depend on someday. Anyway, so that's it for now. Thanks a lot.